Some run slow, some of them are stained, some are very fragile, and they sometimes fail, often. So, why do some people love vintage watches so much? Has it happened to you that you're driving down the road on a normal day and suddenly an old Porsche from the 60s or the 70s passes you by and the engine sounds amazing and it speeds past you, and when you turn to look, it is a beautiful, stunning bright red car, and you see the man driving it with his girlfriend who is 30 or 40 years younger than him. And you see that that man is having the best day of his life, but then 2 blocks later, you find the car with the hood up and the engine smoking a lot. I think this experience is quite comparable to having a vintage watch. Generally, antique watches or vintage watches date back to the 60s or even earlier. But if you do the math, they are watches that have been on this planet for over 60 years. So surely if you're watching this video, any vintage watch is much older than you. But recently the market for vintage watches has grown spectacularly. Watches that you could once find for $500 or $1,000 now cost 10 times more. Now we find that there are collectors who drool and mortgage their homes to be able to afford a Cartier from the 40s, when what was fashionable before were still sports watches. But what is so special about these vintage watches? Why do collectors go so crazy for them? And I think this question has many factors. If you've been in the world of watches for a while, you'll remember about 4 years ago during the pandemic, when the hype watch price bubble was created. What do I mean by this? Well, think about watches like the Royal Oak, the Nautilus, the Overseas, and in general brands like Rolex or Richard Mille that skyrocketed in price and in an unusual way. And this was linked to the fact that these watches were basically impossible to obtain. Now, if at that time you went to any store of these brands and asked for a model, they would most likely mock you, because as I said, it was practically impossible to get one of these pieces. But what does this have to do with vintage watches? Well, it's simple. Well, people got tired of the inflated prices, but above all, the way brands treated customers. But people continued to seek exclusivity. And although the rumor says that all of these hype brands created their own scarcity, with vintage watches it is actually different. Because as I told you, these watches were created, for example, in the 60s. Obviously, at that time, technology was completely different. Machines were different. In fact, all of the manufacturing process and the industry was completely different, and it was much more precarious. In fact, quality control was scarce, but we will return to that topic later. But as an example, in those years, Cartier could only produce between 10 or 15,000 tanks per year, while today they can produce around a million. So that's where the true exclusivity and scarcity come in, because obviously it's not an invented scarcity. For example, Cartier made 10,000 tanks in 1950, and there are no more. But now it becomes an even bigger challenge to find that same tank in an acceptable condition. We won't say good condition, acceptable is where it is. Where someone hasn't polished it and ruined it, or where the dial isn't stained, or there's a lot of breaking going on the enamel of the dial. And again, we're going to return to this topic later. So, if vintage watches are already so scarce, and then you add the factor of finding the watches in good condition, but then you still add that you want of it having original pieces, not authentic of the time, just original from the brand, it obviously becomes virtually impossible to find a vintage piece. I mean, it obviously depends on what brand you're looking for and how rare it is, because I mean, with Orient or Citizen, you're going to find plenty of watches. But as I said, it becomes a challenge to find a good vintage piece. And you also have to research and have to have knowledge on the subject, because Anyone can buy a vintage watch, but not anyone buys a vintage watch with all the original parts where the hands haven't been changed, the dial hasn't been refinished, because that is something that happens quite a lot. So especially among collectors, it becomes a flex being knowledgeable about vintage watches. It becomes a statement. Now let's go back to the little joke I made at the beginning about classic cars breaking down all of the time. Because whether we like it or not, maybe it is a reality that vintage watches are, of course, much more fragile. Because of course they have been over 60 years in service. Some parts are worn out, but still I think that these watches work very well. The curious thing is that these watches were built to last. Well, I mean, obviously their age shows it. They have lasted over 60 years and will continue to last many more. Of course you need to take care of them, but even if they fail, these watches are so well built that with a good service they can be repaired and continue to work for another 10 or 20 years without a problem. While many brands today use disposable materials or movements or plastic parts inside their watches, which will eventually rot and stop working, it is completely the opposite for vintage watches. Okay, but now let's move on to a much more poetic part of this video, where we can treat vintage watches as a relic or as something for a museum, or simply as an open book that tells us a story. Now to start, let's go back to the comment I made about quality control. And I think it's important to emphasize that many of these watches were completely handmade before. So, of course, they could have different defects in the print of the dial, in the centering of the details. All of those aspects were all done by one person. Sometimes I come across people who judge a vintage watch with today's watchmaking standards. And I read some comments like, "Oh, a real AP wouldn't have that flaw on the dial." But if you're talking about a watch from the 50s or the 60s, believe me, it clearly can have many defects. Because the times were different. Why am I so focused on the topic of defects and differences? Now, we're going to return to the comment I made about the dials breaking, or the color fading out, or even change color with the sun, because these details make the watch unique. And an example I could show you would be this Longines watch, with a dial that developed a beautiful leopard-like pattern. And I bet it will be impossible for someone to have one just like it. Now, obviously talking about broken dials, collectors refer to them as spider dials. And it originated because the paint from those years on certain brands wasn't properly tested, and over the years it began to crack and look like a spider web. And I'll repeat this. This was due to low quality control. And the curious thing is that all of these details make the watch worth more to collectors. But why? Because it becomes a watch that is hard to find. But above all, because it becomes a unique watch. As I told you before, a vintage watch tells a story. Maybe it was your grandfather's watch, maybe it was your dad's watch, or maybe it was your great-great-grandfather's watch. And it tells the story of your family. And it's a relic that has been passed down through generations. And surely, if you're lucky, you will pass it on to your son. But I see it the other way around. I don't think that that watch is part of your story, but rather that you are part of the watch story. Now today it's easy to go to any jewelry and buy basically any watch you want. But getting a good vintage watch becomes very difficult due to the limited numbers and the years that they were created. Because you don't really know how many of that watch exist. And at least for me, it's more interesting to talk to someone wearing a vintage watch than someone wearing any current sports model. But what do you think? Now guys, remember that almost 90% of you are not subscribed to the channel. If you like talking about watches and about the market, click the subscribe button, activate the notification bell, and I'll see you here next time.